They were 5 hours from losing their grandson forever when their car died in the snow. With nowhere left to go, they knocked on the one door in the valley no one dares knock on. And when the Mafia boss opened it, they begged, "We can't walk anymore, please. Just one night." What he did next didn't just save the boy. It declared war. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The mountain road stretched empty beneath a sky painted in fading gold. Last light. The kind that doesn't linger, it surrenders. One moment the peaks were burning amber. The next they were swallowed by the blue-gray of a winter evening that had made up its mind. Snow fell without hurry, soft and indifferent, dusting the road in a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate. Like the mountain itself had gone quiet to watch what happened next. And what was happening was this. 2 people were walking where no one should have been walking. Jacob moved with the particular dignity of a man who refused to let his body win the argument. His cane, dark wood, worn smooth from years of use, punched into the snow with every step, sinking deeper than it should have. The ground soft and treacherous beneath the fresh white cover. His coat was heavy and olive green, built for weather but not for this kind of distance. Not at this hour, not at his age. Frost had gathered at his eyebrows. His jaw was set. His eyes stayed forward. Beside him, Maria held his arm with both hands. Her gray scarf was wrapped twice around her neck, the fringe trembling in the wind, her white hair pressed flat beneath the cold. She wore the expression of a woman who had long ago decided that fear was a luxury she could not afford, but her lips had gone pale, and her breathing had grown shallow in the last mile, coming in careful, measured pulls, like she was rationing what remained. They had been walking for nearly 2 hours. Their car, a battered thing that had survived 15 winters and broken down on the 16th, sat dead on the road behind them. Hood up, engine cold, no cell signal, no passing vehicles, nothing but the wind and the sound of their own footsteps and the creaking of Jacob's cane against the ice. "Just a little further," Jacob said. He had been saying it for the last 40 minutes. Maria didn't answer. She leaned into him slightly and kept walking. Below in the valley, the small town they had driven from glowed faintly a loose scatter of lights that looked, from up here, almost warm, almost reachable, but the road back was longer than the road ahead, and they both knew it, and neither said so. Then Maria stopped. Not slowly, not gradually. She simply stopped, the way a person stops when something inside them has made a final, quiet decision. Jacob felt the pull on his arm and turned. She was looking at the ground. Her hands had tightened around his sleeve. When she raised her eyes to his, they were not frightened, they were honest, which was worse. "Jacob," she said softly, "I can't walk anymore." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Jacob looked at her. He took in the pallor of her lips, the way her shoulders had curved inward against the cold, the slight trembling in her hands that she was working hard not to show him. He had been married to this woman for 41 years. He knew the difference between her asking for rest and her telling him the truth. This was the truth. He looked up. Ahead, perhaps a quarter-mile through the trees and the falling snow, something glowed. Not the scattered warmth of the town below, something larger, more deliberate. A structure, set back from the road. Tall wooden doors framed in amber light that spilled outward into the dusk like a fire visible from a long distance. Jacob knew this road. He had driven it 100 times in 40 years of living in this valley. He knew every curve, every landmark, every name attached to every property on the ridge. He knew exactly whose estate that was. The knowing settled over him like the cold itself, slow, total, impossible to reason with. Martinho Torres. The name moved through the valley the way certain names do, quietly, carefully, always with something unsaid attached to it. People in town did not speak it loudly. Teachers did not use it as an example. Old men at the hardware store changed the subject when it came up in conversation, not out of hatred, out of something more instinctive than that, the same instinct that makes you step back from a ledge before your mind has finished deciding to. Martinho Torres had built something in this valley. Not a reputation, exactly. A fact. The kind of fact that does not require repeating because it has already been absorbed into the landscape. Like the mountains themselves, simply there, simply true, impossible to argue with. Jacob had never had reason to knock on that door. He had lived his whole life carefully, ensuring he never would. He looked at the estate, then at Maria, her pale lips, her honest eyes, her hands trembling around his arm. Behind them, 10 miles of frozen road, a dead car, and a town they could not reach on foot. Ahead, light, warmth, a door, and the clock. It was already past 7. The deadline, the one that had sent them out onto this road in the first place, the one they had spent an entire week preparing for and still could not fully meet, expired at midnight. Somewhere in the city, in a building Jacob had never seen and never wanted to, their grandson was being held by men who did not make empty promises. 5 hours. Jacob squared his shoulders. He tightened his grip on his cane. He felt Maria's hands on his arm, cold, trembling, trusting. He was a man who had spent his whole life avoiding the kind of trouble that lived up this road, but the trouble had already found them. It had found them 8 days ago, in the form of fists hammering on their front door at 2 a.m. and men dragging Daniel into the dark. The trouble had already made its choice. Jacob could only make his. "Come on," he said quietly. They walked. The snow fell softly around them. The amber light at the ridge grew closer with each step. The great wooden doors came into full view, wide, solid, built to keep the world out. Jacob raised his hand and knocked. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound of a lock disengaging, a handle turning, and the door swung open, and warm golden light fell across the snow, and the cold, and 2 elderly people standing in the dark. The man in the doorway was tall, black suit, no tie. He held the door handle with one hand, the tattoos visible there, and at his neck, crawling upward from beneath his collar. His dark hair was swept back. His face gave nothing away. His eyes moved over them both slowly, carefully, the way a man looks at something he has not decided the meaning of yet. Silence. Jacob swallowed. "We can't walk anymore," he said quietly. "Please, can we stay one night?" The inside of the estate was warm. That was the first thing Maria noticed. Not the marble floors, not the high ceilings, not the quiet that settled over everything like a second layer of snow. Just the warmth pressing against her cold skin like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. Her body received it the way starving things receive food. Slowly, carefully, as though it couldn't quite believe it was real. Martinho had said nothing more after "come inside." He had simply stepped aside, and they had crossed the threshold, and the door had closed behind them, and that was that. A man appeared, younger, broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that in this house, you did not ask questions, you simply responded to them. Blankets appeared. Thick, dark, expensive, towels, a tray with 2 cups of tea that steamed in the warm air. Maria wrapped both hands around her cup and said nothing. Jacob sat beside her on the edge of a long sofa and stared at the floor. Martinho stood a few feet away, watching them with the same unreadable expression he had worn at the door. He had not sat down. He did not appear to be in any hurry. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who understood that the truth always arrives eventually. You simply had to give it space. It was the warmth that broke Jacob. Not the tea, not the blankets, the warmth. Because warmth, after that kind of cold, does something to a person. It loosens what the cold had locked tight, and what the cold had been locking tight inside Jacob Scott for 8 days. 8 days of quiet terror and desperate planning, and the particular exhaustion of being afraid in silence, so as not to frighten his wife, came loose, all at once. He didn't weep. He was not a man who wept easily, but his hands, wrapped around the cup, began to shake, and Maria saw it, and she reached over and covered them with hers. And that small gesture, that 41 years of instinct, undid something in the room entirely. Martinho watched. Then, quietly, "Why are 2 people your age walking alone in this weather?" Jacob looked up, and he told him. It had been 8 days ago, a Thursday, just past 2 a.m. Jacob had been asleep when the knocking started, not knocking really. Hammering. The kind that does not ask permission, that arrives already certain of its welcome. He had sat up in the dark, heart already ahead of his mind, already knowing before he knew. Their house was small. 3 rooms and a kitchen and a porch that leaned slightly to the left and had been leaning that way for 11 years. It was the kind of house that held its occupants close, which meant that when the front door came open and the men walked in, there was nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, and no distance to put between yourself and what was happening. There had been 4 of them. Large men in dark coats, moving through the small house like it was already theirs. 1 had stayed by the door. 2 had gone directly to Daniel's room. They knew which room it was, which told Jacob something cold and specific about how long this had been coming. The fourth had stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at Jacob with the flat, professional calm of a man entirely unbothered by what he was doing. "Your grandson owes money," he had said, simply, factually, the way you might read an item from a grocery list. Maria had appeared in the hallway in her dressing gown, and Jacob had moved instinctively between her and the man, which the man had found mildly amusing. Then Daniel had come out of his room, not dragged, walking, which was somehow worse the way he walked, shoulders dropped, eyes on the floor. The particular posture of someone who has known this moment was coming and has been dreading it for longer than anyone around him realized. He was 22 years old, and he looked, in that moment, like a boy of 12 who had broken something irreplaceable and could not find the words. "Grandpa," he had said, just that. Jacob had stepped forward. One of the large men had put a hand on his chest, flat-palmed. Not violent, simply immovable, the way a wall is immovable. Jacob had pushed against it anyway, because he was 68 years old, and Daniel had been 8 when his parents died, and Jacob had promised at a graveside on a cold morning 14 years ago that he would not let anything happen to this boy. He pushed against the hand pushed back. Jacob went down, not hard, not with malice, simply down, his hip against the kitchen floor, his cane skittering away. Maria had cried out one sharp sound, quickly swallowed and rushed to him. Daniel had watched this happen. The expression on his face in that moment was something Jacob would carry for the rest of his life. Not fear, not shame, exactly. Something beyond both. The look of a young man seeing, with terrible clarity, the precise cost of his own choices measured not in money but in an old man on a kitchen floor. 1 week, the man by the door had said. Midnight, the full amount, or you never hear from him again. And then they were gone. And the house was quiet again, and Maria was on her knees beside Jacob, her hands on his face, and Daniel was no longer in the room. Jacob stopped talking. The teacup in his hands had gone still. The fire in the estate's hearth moved quietly in the silence. Maria reached into the pocket of her coat and placed a worn envelope on the table between them and Martinho. It had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases had gone soft. "We gathered everything," she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. Savings, jewelry, everything we had left. She paused. "It's not enough." She looked at Martinho directly. "But it is everything we have." Martinho looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. His jaw had shifted barely, almost imperceptibly at some point during Jacob's telling. Not at the men, not at the debt. At a specific moment. At the name Jacob had mentioned. The man who had sent them. The man who was holding Daniel. Martinho's eyes moved from the envelope to Jacob. "What did you say his name was?" Jacob told him again. The room went very still. And something behind Martinho's expression, something that had nothing to do with 2 elderly strangers on his doorstep, quietly ignited. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow had thickened. It pressed against the tall windows of the estate in soft, soundless waves. The kind of snowfall that doesn't announce itself, that simply accumulates, quietly burying everything beneath it until the world looks entirely different from how it did before. Maria watched it through the glass for a moment. Then she looked back at the man sitting across from them. Martinho Torres had not moved. He sat with the stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with silence, who did not fill it, did not shift uncomfortably inside it, did not reach for words the way most people do when a room goes quiet. He simply occupied it. Like the furniture, like the walls, like something that had always been here and intended to remain. His hands rested on his knees. The tattoos were visible in the firelight dark, intricate patterns climbing from beneath his cuffs and disappearing upward toward the collar of his black jacket. His face was sharp-featured, close-cropped dark beard, hair swept back with the kind of effortlessness that suggested it had simply always fallen that way. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years older. It was difficult to tell with men like him, men whose faces had been weathered not by sun or age but by the specific weight of the life they had chosen. He was looking at Jacob with an expression that Maria could not fully read. Not coldness, not warmth. Something more precise than either. Calculation, perhaps, but behind the calculation something else. Something that had shifted in the room the moment Jacob had spoken the name. Something that had not shifted back. "How long ago did they come?" Martinho asked. 8 days, Jacob said. "And the deadline? Midnight tonight." Martinho looked at the window. At the snow. then back. "How much are you short?" Jacob and Maria exchanged a glance, the kind that carries an entire conversation inside it, the shorthand of people who have spent decades learning each other's silences. Then Jacob named the figure, the gap between what they had gathered and what was owed. Martinho said nothing. He rose from his chair. Not quickly, deliberately, the way he did everything, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never needed to rush, because the room had always been willing to wait for him. He walked to the window and stood with his back to them, looking out at the snow-covered valley below. Maria watched him. She had spent her life reading people not from suspicion, but from the particular attentiveness of someone who had raised a difficult child, buried a daughter, held a family together through losses that should have dismantled it entirely. She had learned to look past what people showed and toward what they were carrying. This man was carrying something. She didn't know what it was, but she recognized the weight of it. "You don't have to be afraid in this house," Martinho said without turning around. His voice was even. Flat, almost but not unkind. "We're not afraid," Maria said. He turned then, looked at her, and something in his expression shifted the faintest adjustment, barely visible, like a door opened an inch and then held there. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think you are." He moved back toward the center of the room. Not toward them, toward the side table near the fireplace, where a phone sat face down. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand once, the way a man handles something he has already decided to use but is taking one final moment to consider. Then he looked at Jacob. "The man who has your grandson," he said. "You said his name." "I want you to say it again." Jacob said it. Martinho's jaw tightened. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone performing an emotion for an audience, in the way of someone privately confirming something they had already suspected, fitting a piece into a shape that had been waiting for it. "You know him," Maria said. It was not a question. "I know of him," Martinho said carefully. "Everyone in this valley knows of him." A pause. "But yes, he and I have history." He did not elaborate, and something in his tone made clear that elaboration was not on offer. He looked at the envelope still sitting on the table. The worn, folded envelope with its soft creases and its insufficient contents. He looked at it the way you look at something that represents an enormous effort made under impossible circumstances, not with pity, but with a specific, quiet respect. He did not touch it. "You're not paying anyone tonight," he said. Jacob frowned. "We didn't come here for charity. We came because we had no other." "I know why you came." Martinho's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You came because your car died, and your wife couldn't walk anymore, and there was a light at the top of a hill. That's all." He held Jacob's gaze. "I'm not offering charity. I'm telling you how tonight is going to go." The fire shifted, a log settling. Outside, a sound low, distant, engine deep. Maria turned toward the window. Down the long driveway that curved away from the estate and disappeared into the tree line, headlights were appearing. One set, then another, then a third, black SUVs, moving in unhurried convoy through the snow. She turned back to Martinho. He was already sliding his phone into his jacket pocket, already straightening his cuffs, already becoming, before her eyes, something slightly different from the man who had opened the door to two exhausted strangers 20 minutes ago. The edges of him sharpened. The stillness changed quality from the stillness of someone at rest to the stillness of something about to move. "Your grandson," he said. "What's his name?" "Daniel," Maria said. Martinho nodded once. Then he walked to the door of the room and paused, one hand on the frame. He looked back at them, Jacob with his worn cane across his knees, Maria with her pale hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. Two people who had walked miles through the snow and knocked on the most dangerous door in the valley because they had run out of every other option. He studied them for a moment. "Stay here," he said. "Stay warm." He left the room, and from outside, the sound of engines grew closer, and doors opened, and boots moved across gravel beneath the falling snow, and for the first time in 8 days, something shifted in Maria's chest. Not relief, not yet, but the faint, fragile possibility of it. The room breathed without them. That was how it felt after Martinho left, like the space itself exhaled, releasing something that had been held taut since the moment he had walked back from the window. The fire continued its quiet work. The snow continued its patient accumulation against the glass, and Jacob and Maria sat together on the long sofa in the warm amber light of a house that belonged to a man they feared, surrounded by a comfort they had not earned, and could not explain. Jacob set his cane against the cushion beside him. It was a small gesture, barely worth noticing, but Maria noticed it because in 41 years, she had never once seen him set his cane down in a stranger's home. He always kept it in hand, always ready. The cane was the last line of his independence, and he guarded it the way men of his generation guarded the things they could not afford to lose. He set it down. She reached over and took his hand. They didn't speak for a while. The fire was enough. The warmth was enough. Outside, the muffled sounds of the arriving vehicles had settled into silence, doors closing, engines idling, then stilling, men moving with the quiet purposefulness of people who had been given instructions and required no further explanation. Then footsteps in the hallway. Not Martinho. Lighter, quicker. The broad-shouldered young man who had brought the tea reappeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with bread and something warm in a small pot. He set it on the low table without a word, refilled their cups, and made to leave. "Excuse me," Maria said. He stopped. "How long have you worked for him?" The young man considered the question as though calculating how much of an answer was appropriate. "Long enough," he said. Then after a pause, "He's not what people say." Maria studied him. "What do people say?" He almost smiled. "Things that keep them from knocking on this door." He looked at the tray. "Please eat. It'll be a while before he's back." He left. Jacob looked at the bread. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man whose body had finally been given permission to remember how hungry it was, he reached for it. They ate in silence. And it was in that silence, warm, fed, the immediate crisis of the cold no longer pressing against every thought, that the other thing moved back in. The thing that the cold and the walking and the sheer physical emergency of the last 2 hours had temporarily displaced. "Daniel." Maria set her cup down. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire and let herself think about him fully, for the first time since they had left the house that morning. Not the logistics of it, not the envelope, not the deadline, not the impossible arithmetic of the debt. Just Daniel himself. The boy. The specific, irreplaceable, infuriating, deeply loved boy who had come to live with them at 8 years old, because the world had taken his parents on a wet road on an ordinary Tuesday and left him with nothing but 2 grandparents who were already old and a bedroom that used to be a storage room. He had been difficult from the beginning. Not cruel, never cruel, but restless in the way of children who carry grief they don't have the language for. He broke things. Not on purpose, mostly. He argued about everything. He pushed every boundary Jacob set with the systematic determination of someone conducting an experiment. He stayed out too late, brought home friends Jacob didn't trust, made choices that kept Maria awake long after Jacob had convinced himself everything would be fine. But he had also, on the morning of Maria's 68th birthday, woken before sunrise and made breakfast badly, and presented it to her with the serious, earnest pride of someone who had done something extraordinary. He had sat beside Jacob for 4 hours at the hospital the winter Jacob's knee had needed looking at, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had simply appeared, coat still on, and said, "I'm not going anywhere." He was not a bad boy. He was a boy who had been handed a loss too large for his age, and had never quite found the right way to carry it. Maria understood that now, in a way she hadn't when it was happening, when she was exhausted and worried, and sometimes quietly furious at him for making everything so hard. She understood it the way you understand most important things. Too late, and all at once. The fire popped softly. Jacob was looking at her. "He's alive," Jacob said. Not as comfort, as fact, as the thing he had been repeating to himself for 8 days, to keep the alternative at a safe distance. "I know," Maria said. "Martinho will." "I know, Jacob." He nodded, looked at the fire. "I should have seen it coming. The people he was spending time with. I knew something was wrong months ago, and I told myself it was just Daniel being Daniel. We both knew. I should have said something, done something." "Jacob." Her voice was quiet but firm in the way it got when she needed him to stop punishing himself for being human. "We're here now. That's what matters. We're here, and we're doing something." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We knocked on a Mafia boss's door." "Yes." "And he let us in." "Yes." Jacob looked around the room. The high walls, the careful luxury of it, the fire, the warmth. "Not what I expected," he said softly. "People rarely are," Maria said. Footsteps again in the hallway, heavier this time. deliberate. Martinho came back into the room and stood near the doorway. His jacket was buttoned now. His phone was in his hand, screen dark. Something about him had reorganized. The quality of his stillness had changed again, tightening into something with direction, with momentum, with the particular focus of a man who has made a decision and is already 3 steps into executing it. He looked at them both. "The cars are ready," he said. Jacob straightened. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not spending tonight waiting and wondering." Martinho held his gaze. "It means we're going to go and get your grandson." Maria's breath caught. "Both of us?" Jacob asked. Martinho looked at him, at the cane, at Maria's still pale face, at 2 people in their late 60s who had walked miles through the snow on the final night of an impossible deadline. "Both of you," he said. He said it like it was never a question. The convoy moved in silence. 3 black SUVs arranged with the quiet precision of something that had been choreographed long before tonight. The lead vehicle already at the estate gate, when Martinho brought Jacob and Maria through the front doors. The third pulling smoothly into position behind, as though it had always been there. No urgency, no noise, just movement, controlled and certain, the way water moves when it has already found its channel. Martinho held the rear door of the middle vehicle open. Jacob looked at it, then at Martinho. The look of a man privately reckoning with the distance between the life he had lived and the one he currently found himself inside. He got in. Maria followed without hesitation. Martinho closed the door behind them and moved to the front passenger seat. The moment he sat down, the driver pulled away, and the estate, its warm amber light, its tall wooden doors, its fire still burning in the empty room, receded behind them into the snow. The road wound downward through the trees, dark trunks on either side, headlights cutting white tunnels through the falling snow. Jacob watched the landscape pass and said nothing. Maria sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes forward, her breathing even. In the front, Martinho was on the phone. He spoke quietly, in short, specific sentences. Not commands, exactly more like coordinates, delivered to people who already understood the map. He listened, spoke again, listened, then ended the call and sat looking at the road ahead with the focused, inward expression of someone running through a sequence of moves before executing them. His lieutenant, a lean, gray-eyed man in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, visible through the windshield ahead, had asked him privately, before they loaded the cars, why he was doing this personally. Martinho had looked at him. "Because it needs to be done correctly," he said. The lieutenant had understood that this was not the full answer. He had worked with Martinho long enough to know when the door was open and when it was simply ajar. He had not pressed further. The full answer was more complicated. It had to do with a rival who had, for the better part of 8 months, been conducting himself with the specific recklessness of a man who had mistaken tolerance for weakness. Small violations at first. Territory boundaries pushed 1 inch, then 2. Supply arrangements altered unilaterally. Agreements honored selectively, when it suited, and set aside when it didn't. The kind of behavior that, in Martinho's world, carried a clear meaning, not aggression, exactly, a test. A prolonged, incremental test of what he could get away with, and how far the silence on the other side of it would extend. Martinho had let it run. Not from weakness, from preference. He did not move on problems before he understood them fully. Their dimensions, their roots, the precise point at which they would need to be ended. Patience was not passive in his world. It was its own form of control, but tonight was different. Tonight the man had reached past the boundaries of everything Martinho considered negotiable and touched something that existed entirely outside the logic of business, territory, and debt. He had put his hands on grandparents. Martinho's eyes stayed on the road. There was a rule unwritten, never discussed, requiring no enforcement because it was simply understood by anyone operating at any serious level in this world that civilians did not get touched. Not spouses, not children. Certainly not elderly people whose only crime was loving someone who had made bad choices. The rule existed not from sentimentality but from necessity. The moment you started reaching into the lives of ordinary people, people with no power, no leverage, no part in any of this, you became something different, something without boundaries, something that justified responses that nobody wanted and that benefited no one. It was the line. And the man holding Daniel had crossed it. Jacob and Maria had walked miles through the snow on the coldest night of the year and knocked on the most feared door in the valley because there was nowhere else left to go. That was what crossing the line looked like when it landed in the real world. Not in abstract, not in principle, but in an old woman's pale lips and a man's frost-covered eyebrows and a worn envelope of money that represented an entire life's savings and still wasn't enough. Martinho had looked at that envelope. He had not touched it, but he had seen it. He turned slightly in his seat to check on the couple behind him. Jacob was sitting upright, cane between his knees, watching the road with an expression of grim and determined calm. Maria was beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Her eyes were closed, not sleeping, he could tell, simply present, holding herself steady in the way people do when they are conserving the last of something. "How long?" he asked the driver. 20 minutes. Maybe less in this weather. Martinho nodded. He looked back at the road. Jacob cleared his throat. "Mr. Torres." Martinho turned. "We don't want anyone hurt on our account," Jacob said, carefully. The way a man speaks when he is trying to be honest about something that might not be welcome. "We just want Daniel back. That's all we came for." Martinho studied him for a moment. "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" Jacob held his gaze. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "Nobody's going to get hurt tonight," Martinho said. "That's not how I handle things." This surprised Jacob. He could not fully conceal it. The slight adjustment of his expression, the almost imperceptible loosening of something held tight across his shoulders. Martinho looked back at the road. "The man who has your grandson made a mistake," he said quietly. "Not just with your family, with me. Tonight I'm correcting both problems at once." A pause. "Your grandson comes home. The other matter gets resolved. Clean. Silence." Then Maria, eyes still closed, said softly, "And if he doesn't cooperate?" Martinho's jaw shifted once. "He will," he said. The convoy moved through the snow. The lights of the valley fell away behind them. Ahead, the road curved toward the lower industrial edge of the valley floor. Warehouses, dark buildings, the kind of part of any town that exists specifically to conduct business, that the rest of the town prefers not to think about. The warehouse district appeared in the distance, and Martinho straightened in his seat, and the cars did not slow down. The road flattened. The mountain curves gave way to long, straight stretches through the lower valley bare trees on either side, their branches heavy with accumulated snow, bending slightly under the weight of it, the way people bend under the weight of things they didn't ask to carry. The convoy held its pace, steady, unhurried. The kind of movement that understands it has already won whatever argument the destination might try to make. Inside the middle SUV, the heater ran quietly. Maria had opened her eyes. She was watching the back of Martinho's head, the way his hair was swept back, the tattoos visible above his collar, climbing the left side of his neck, disappearing behind his ear. She had been watching him since his answer about the rival, not with suspicion, with the particular attentiveness she brought to things she was still trying to understand. "Do you have family?" she asked. Jacob glanced at her. The question surprised him not because it was inappropriate, but because Maria had always possessed a specific courage in asking the things other people carefully avoided. Martinho didn't turn around immediately. The road moved beneath them. Snow tapped softly against the windshield. The wipers swept it away in steady, rhythmic arcs. "My mother," he said finally. "She's still alive. In the south. Do you see her often?" A pause. "Not as often as I should." Maria nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "And your father?" The silence this time was different in texture. Longer, held from a different place. "He died when I was 11, Martinho said. "Heart attack. Unexpected." "I'm sorry," Maria said. And she meant it in the specific, undecorated way she meant most things, without performance, without filler. Just the plain fact of her sympathy, placed quietly in the space between them. Martinho's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. "It was a long time ago." "It doesn't matter how long ago it was," Maria said. 11 is too young to lose a father. A boy that age needs someone to show him how the world works." Another silence. But this one felt different from the ones before it, not closed, not carefully managed. More like something turning over slowly in the dark. "There were men in the neighborhood," Martinho said. "They showed me." He said it without bitterness, without self-pity. As simple fact, the kind of fact that has been examined so many times over so many years, that all the sharp edges have been worn smooth, leaving just the shape of it, just the outline of how one thing had led to another. Maria looked at the back of his head. "Daniel lost his parents at 8, she said softly. Martinho's jaw shifted. Jacob told me. He's not a bad boy, Maria said. The words carried the weight of someone who has said them many times to teachers, to neighbors, to herself in the dark at 2 a.m. He's a boy who was handed something too heavy and never learned how to set it down properly. So he carried it badly. Made it everyone else's problem sometimes. She paused. But he is not bad. I didn't say he was. No, Maria agreed. You didn't. The lead vehicle's brake lights flared briefly as the convoy navigated a long bend in the road. Jacob was watching the trees. His hand had found Maria's at some point in the last few minutes. Neither of them had acknowledged it. Some boys, Martino said, almost to the windshield, don't know how to ask for help. They learn early that asking costs something, so they stop asking. They start taking instead, or borrowing, or doing whatever gets them through, without having to admit they're struggling. A pause. It gets them into rooms they don't know how to get out of. Jacob turned from the window and looked at the back of Martino's head. Is that what happened to you? He asked. The directness of it sat in the air. Martino didn't answer immediately. The driver kept his eyes on the road. The heater hummed. Outside, the snow fell in long, patient curtains across the headlight beams. Something like that, Martino said finally. Jacob nodded slowly. Daniel asked for help once, about 18 months ago. Came to me late one evening, sat at the kitchen table, started to say something. He stopped, swallowed. I could see it, he was right there at the edge of it, and I said the wrong thing. Something about responsibility, about consequences. His voice had gone quiet. He closed up, didn't say another word about it. 3 weeks later, he was already in with those men. The SUV moved through the snow. Jacob, Maria said gently. I've thought about that evening every day since, Jacob said. Not to Maria, not quite to Martino either, to the space in front of him. One conversation, one moment, where I chose the speech over the listening, and everything that followed came from that. Martino was quiet for a long moment. Then, you couldn't have known. I should have felt it, Jacob said. He was right there. Yes, Martino said. He was, and he came to you. That matters more than what happened next. He paused. A boy who comes to his grandfather's kitchen table at night looking for a way to say something difficult, that boy is not lost. He just missed the door that time. Jacob looked at the back of his head. Something in his chest shifted quietly, without drama, the way the most significant things tend to move. Tonight, Martino continued, we give him another door. No one spoke after that. The convoy crested a low rise and the valley floor opened before them, flat, dark, industrial. And there, perhaps half a mile ahead, a cluster of low buildings sat beneath the snow. Corrugated rooflines, sparse lighting, a chain-link perimeter running the length of the property. The warehouse. Maria's grip tightened on Jacob's hand. Jacob leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the building where his grandson had spent 8 days in the dark. Martino straightened, picked up his phone, sent one message, put it back, and said quietly and with total certainty, he's in there, and in 20 minutes he won't be. The convoy stopped 200 meters short of the warehouse. No dramatic entrance, no headlights sweeping the building like an announcement. The 3 vehicles simply pulled to the side of the road in the shadow of a long tree line and went dark, engines cutting one after another in quiet succession, like a sentence ending without punctuation. Around them, the snow continued to fall. Indifferent, patient. Martino stepped out first. He stood for a moment in the cold, looking at the warehouse. His breath moved in slow, visible clouds. He didn't button his jacket. He didn't appear to feel the cold the way ordinary men feel it, or if he did, he had long ago decided it was beneath his attention. He turned and opened the rear door. Jacob made to get out. Martino placed one hand gently, but with finality on the doorframe. Not yet, he said. Jacob looked at him. You'll see him soon, Martino said. I need you to stay here until I come back for you. Both of you. Maria put her hand on Jacob's arm. He held Martino's gaze for a long moment, the look of a man who has spent 68 years being the one who handles things, who does not naturally accept the instruction to wait. Then something in him yielded. Not weakness, recognition. The understanding that the right thing, in this moment, was to trust. He sat back. Martino closed the door. He spoke briefly to his lieutenant, 2 sentences, quiet and precise. The lieutenant nodded and moved toward the other vehicles. Doors opened. Men stepped out, 6 of them, moving with the contained, unhurried efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before and required neither instruction nor reassurance. They dispersed into the dark, with a quiet that was almost unsettling, slipping into positions around the building's perimeter that they had clearly already been given, coordinates delivered in the phone calls during the drive. No weapons visible, but they were there. Martino walked toward the warehouse alone. He carried a briefcase, black, unremarkable. He had retrieved it from the lead vehicle without ceremony, holding it at his side with the ease of someone carrying nothing more significant than paperwork. His footsteps were steady in the snow. His posture was straight. He walked the way he did everything, as though the outcome was already settled, and this was simply the administrative portion of the evening. The warehouse had a single steel door on the near side, lit by one bare bulb above the frame, casting a weak yellow circle into the snow. A man stood outside it, large, coated, watching Martino approach with the particular alertness of someone who recognizes what they are looking at and is recalibrating accordingly. Martino stopped 3 feet from him. "Tell him I'm here," he said. The man looked at him for a moment, then went inside. Inside the SUV, Jacob watched through the windshield. He could see the door, the light, the small yellow circle in the snow. He could see Martino standing in it, still, waiting, briefcase at his side. Maria was not watching the door. She was praying. Jacob had not seen her pray in years, not since the funeral, not since the graveside on that cold morning when they had stood over their daughter and her husband and tried to find something to hold on to in a world that had suddenly removed its floor. She sat with her eyes closed and her lips barely moving, and her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Jacob did not disturb her. He simply put his hand over hers and watched the door and waited. The steel door opened. A man emerged. He was perhaps 50. Heavy-set, with a thick jaw, and the kind of confidence that sits permanently in the shoulders of men who have never yet encountered something they couldn't buy their way out of. He wore a coat that was too expensive for a warehouse, and an expression that was working hard to project amusement. He looked at Martino, then he laughed. Not nervously, genuinely, or performing genuine with considerable skill. He spread his hands wide in the universal gesture of theatrical welcome and said something Jacob couldn't hear through the glass. His posture was loose, relaxed. The posture of a man on his own territory who considers the arrival of another man a form of entertainment. Martino said nothing for a moment. Then he set the briefcase on the ground between them, opened it. Even from 200 meters, in the dark, Jacob could see the contents, the neat, substantial weight of it. The rival looked down, his amusement recalibrated, not disappearing, but adjusting, tightening. Martino spoke. Jacob still couldn't hear the words, but he could read the shape of them, the economy of them, the flatness of delivery, the way Martino's body did not shift or lean or perform any of the physical language of negotiation. He was not negotiating. Maria had opened her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered. "He put money on the ground," Jacob said. "A lot of it." The rival looked at the briefcase, looked at Martino. Something in his expression moved a flicker of something beneath the confidence. Not fear yet, but the earliest ancestor of it. Then Martino said something else. 4 words, perhaps 5. Jacob couldn't read them, but he saw what happened when they landed. The rival's amusement collapsed. Not gradually, not with dignity, all at once, like a structure whose load-bearing element has been abruptly removed. His shoulders came down. His chin came up defensively, which is what chins do when the rest of the body has already understood something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. Because around the building, from the shadows at the perimeter, from behind vehicles, from the dark spaces between structures that the single bare bulb couldn't reach, Martino's men stepped forward, not rushing, not dramatic, simply appearing, present, positioned, and entirely unhurried. The rival looked left, then right, then back at Martino. Martino looked at him with the expression of a man watching something confirm exactly what he had expected. The steel door behind the rival opened again, and Daniel appeared in the doorway. Jacob made a sound, not a word, not a name, something below language, something that came from the part of a person that exists before words were invented. Maria pressed her hand against the window. Daniel stood in the doorway, bruised and pale, blinking in the cold air, alive, upright, eyes moving across the scene in front of him with the stunned, overwhelmed expression of someone emerging from a long dark into sudden, unexpected light. Jacob's hand was already on the door handle. Martino did not move. That was the thing Jacob noticed from inside the SUV. Even with Daniel visible in the doorway, even with the rival's confidence visibly crumbling, even with 6 men having materialized from the shadows around the building's perimeter, like something the darkness had quietly been holding in reserve. Martinho did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing when the briefcase hit the ground. Same posture, same stillness. One hand at his side, the other loose, relaxed, like a man waiting for a bus. The rival was looking at the men around him. His eyes moved from left to right and back again, quick, calculating. The eyes of someone running numbers on a problem and arriving repeatedly at the same unacceptable answer. His 2 men, who had been standing near the warehouse door with the easy confidence of people operating on their own ground, had gone very still, not reaching for anything, not moving, just standing the way people stand when they have correctly assessed that movement would be inadvisable. Martinho let the silence do its work. Then he spoke. His voice was level. Jacob still couldn't hear the words through the glass, but he could see their effect the way they landed on the rival with the quiet, specific force of something that had been prepared carefully and delivered without excess. The rival's jaw tightened. He looked at the briefcase, then back at Martinho. Then Martinho said something else, and this time the rival went pale. Not gradually. The color simply left his face the way light leaves a room when a switch is thrown present, then absent, the transition instantaneous. His mouth opened slightly. Whatever response he had been preparing dissolved before it reached his lips. Jacob leaned toward Maria. Something just changed. "I see it," she said. What Martinho had told him, what Jacob and Maria would only understand later, pieced together from fragments, was this: the rival's primary financial infrastructure, the accounts through which his operation moved its money, had been frozen. Not by law enforcement. By a series of calls Martinho had made in the 40 minutes between the convoy leaving the estate and arriving at this warehouse. Calls to people who owed him favors, who managed certain financial arrangements in certain institutions, who understood that when Martinho Torres made a specific kind of request, it was not actually a request. The rival's supply routes, 3 of them, carefully constructed over 2 years, had been simultaneously suspended. The men who ran those routes had each received a single call, from different voices, with the same message. He was not being threatened with violence. He was being shown, calmly and comprehensively, that everything he had built was currently suspended in the air above him, held there by Martinho's decision to let it remain, and that this decision could be revised at any moment. Psychological defeat, total, without a single act of violence. Martinho stepped forward. 1 step, closing the distance between them to something intimate and deliberate. He looked at the rival with the expression of a man addressing something that has disappointed him less through malice than through a fundamental failure of judgment. "You owed me first," he said, quietly enough that Jacob couldn't hear it, clearly enough that the rival heard nothing else. "Before this family, before any of this, you owed me first. And instead of settling that debt, you spent the last 8 months testing my patience and terrorizing grandparents." He paused. "Now you owe me twice. And the second debt is not financial." The rival looked at him. "What is it?" he managed. "Your operation," Martinho said simply. "Every route, every account, every arrangement you've built in this valley, it comes under new management. Effective tonight." He held his gaze. "You keep your life, you keep your health, you lose everything else, and you leave this valley within 48 hours. The rival stared at him. "And if I don't?" Martinho looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the briefcase from the ground, closed it, and handed it to his lieutenant, who had appeared silently at his right shoulder. "You will," he said. He turned away from the rival, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the absolute certainty of someone who has finished a conversation, and looked toward the warehouse doorway, where Daniel still stood. Jacob was already out of the SUV. He hadn't planned it, hadn't decided it. His hand had simply opened the door, and his body had followed the instinct that had been building since the moment Daniel appeared in the doorway, the same instinct that had driven him out of bed at 2 a.m. 8 days ago, that had put him on the frozen road, that had raised his hand to knock on a feared man's door. He crossed the snow in the dark. Daniel saw him coming. Something broke open in the young man's face, not slowly, not with any of the careful self-control he had spent years cultivating as his primary defense against a world that had hurt him early and thoroughly. It broke open all at once, the way things break when they have been held together past their limit. And what was underneath was not the stubborn, difficult, closed-off young man who had borrowed money from dangerous people and gotten his grandparents dragged into the worst night of their lives. What was underneath was the 8-year-old boy, the one from the graveside. The one who had stood in a too large suit between two grandparents who were also grieving and had held himself very still because he had somehow understood, at 8 years old, that if he came apart, everyone else would too. He came apart now. "Grandpa," Jacob reached him. He put both arms around his grandson, dropping his cane in the snow without noticing, without caring, pulling Daniel into an embrace with the full strength of a man who had been holding this moment in reserve for 8 days and was now releasing it all at once. Daniel was taller than him by 4 inches, and broader across the shoulders, and none of that mattered at all. Jacob held him the way you hold the irreplaceable thing you were afraid you'd lost. Daniel was shaking. "I'm sorry," he said into Jacob's shoulder. The words broken, repeated. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry." "I've got you," Jacob said. "I've got you. You're all right." Maria had reached them. She put her arms around both of them, one hand on Jacob's back, one on Daniel's, and pressed her forehead against her grandson's arm, and closed her eyes and said nothing at all because there was nothing that needed saying, because this was the only thing that had needed to happen, and it was happening, and that was enough. The snow fell softly around the three of them. Martinho stood several feet away and watched. His lieutenant appeared at his shoulder, said nothing. Martinho didn't look at him. His eyes were on the family in the snow, the old man without his cane, the woman with her eyes closed, the young man with his face buried, and his shoulders shaking. Something moved across Martinho's expression. Not softness, exactly. Something more complicated than softness. The particular expression of a man who is witnessing something he recognizes from a great distance. Something he has no personal map to but understands nonetheless, the way you can recognize a language you've never spoken. He looked away, picked up Jacob's cane from the snow, held it. When Daniel had steadied enough to lift his head, when the shaking had reduced to something manageable, when the three of them had simply stood together in the cold for long enough that the worst of it had passed, Martinho walked over. Daniel saw him coming and straightened instinctively, some defensive reflex firing even now. His eyes were red. His face was bruised along the left jaw. His lip had been split at some point in the last 8 days, and had healed badly. Martinho held out the cane to Jacob, who took it without a word. Then he looked at Daniel. He studied him for a long moment, the bruises, the red eyes, the posture of someone braced for one more thing to go wrong. "You know who I am?" Martinho asked. Daniel nodded. "Then you understand that I'm not someone who makes statements he doesn't intend to keep." He held the young man's gaze. "You put these two through something they should never have had to survive. You stress them again in any way, for any reason, and I will know about it." He let that land. "Do you understand me?" Daniel swallowed. "Yes," he said, his voice raw, genuine. Martinho looked at him for one more moment. "Good," he said. He stepped back, and the convoy waited in the snow, engines starting one by one, and the rival stood in the warehouse doorway watching everything he had built evaporate quietly into the cold night air, and Jacob held his grandson's arm, and Maria held Jacob's hand, and they walked back to the car. They drove back through the snow in silence, not the silence of discomfort or unresolved tension, the silence of people who have passed through something together and arrived on the other side of it, and don't yet have the words for what that means. The kind of silence that is not empty but full, weighted with everything that had just happened and everything that had almost happened, and the thin, dizzying distance between the two. Daniel sat between his grandparents in the rear of the middle SUV. He was too large for the space, broad-shouldered, long-legged, folded slightly inward, the way tall people fold in confined spaces. His hands rested on his knees. He was looking at them, not at the road, not at the back of Martinho's head in the front seat, but at his grandparents, back and forth. Jacob to Maria, Maria to Jacob, as though he was checking that they were real, as though some part of him was still in the warehouse, still in the dark, still not certain that this was actually happening. Maria kept her hand on his arm. She had not removed it since they got in the car. Jacob stared at the road ahead. His jaw was working slightly, the private, internal effort of a man processing something too large to hold all at once, breaking it into smaller pieces, and working through them methodically. His cane stood between his knees. His hands on top of it were steady now, steadier than they had been in the warehouse, steadier than they had been for 8 days. "Are you hurt?" Maria asked Daniel. She had asked it twice already. She would ask it again. "I'm okay," Daniel said. The same answer. But this time he said it differently, not dismissively, not the reflexive self-sufficiency he had cultivated since childhood. He said it looking at her. Present, meaning it as comfort, not deflection. Maria looked at the bruise along his jaw. That needs looking at when we get home. It's fine, Gran. It needs looking at, she said firmly. And the firmness of it, the absolute ordinary domestic authority of it, the way it sounded exactly like every other time she had insisted on something for his well-being over 22 years, made something loosen in Daniel's face. His throat moved. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. The convoy moved through the lower valley, retracing the route they had driven an hour before. The warehouse district fell away behind them. The trees returned on either side. The snow kept falling, gentle and constant, covering the road behind them as they went, as though the landscape itself was closing over the evening, smoothing it back into white, returning everything to the clean, unmarked surface of before. Martinho had not spoken since they got in the car. He sat in the front passenger seat looking at the road ahead, with the expression of a man who has completed something, and is now simply allowing the completion to exist, without adding anything to it. His phone was in his hand, but the screen was dark. He was not making calls. He was not issuing further instructions. He was, for the first time since Jacob and Maria had knocked on his door, entirely still. Daniel looked at the back of his head. He had known the name Martinho Torres the way everyone his age in the valley knew it, not from direct experience, but from the way the name existed in the atmosphere of certain conversations, certain places, certain silences that fell when it was mentioned. He had known it as something to be respected from a distance, something that existed in a separate register from ordinary life. He had not expected this. He had not expected the cars in the snow, or the briefcase, or the way the rival's confidence had evaporated without a single act of violence. He had not expected to be walked out of that warehouse and handed back to his grandfather by someone the entire valley feared. He had not expected to feel, toward this man, something close to gratitude. "Mr. Torres," Daniel said. Martinho turned slightly. "Thank you." He said it plainly, without performance. The way young men say things when they have been humbled past the point where pride has any function left. I don't know why you did this, but thank you." Martinho looked at him for a moment. "Your grandparents walked miles through the snow tonight," he said. "In the cold. On the last night of a deadline they couldn't meet, because they were not willing to leave you in that building." He held Daniel's gaze. "That's why I did this. Because of them." A pause. "Remember that." Daniel looked at Jacob. Jacob was looking at the road, but his jaw had tightened the particular tightening of a man absorbing something he will carry for a long time. Daniel looked at Maria. She was watching him with the expression she had worn his entire life, that specific, steady, inexhaustible look that he had taken for granted for 22 years, that he had sometimes found suffocating in the way that the things we most need can feel suffocating when we are young and foolish enough to think we don't need them. He had never been so grateful for it. "Gran," he said. His voice broke on the single syllable. "I know," she said. She squeezed his arm. "I know, sweetheart. I'm going to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm going to fix this. All of it. I'm going to—" "You don't have to say it tonight," Maria said gently. "You just have to mean it." He nodded, eyes wet. "I mean it." The estate appeared ahead through the trees, the amber light still burning behind the tall wooden doors, exactly as they had left it. The fire inside still going, the warmth still present and waiting like something that had expected them to return. The convoy pulled through the gate. The cars stopped. Martinho got out first and opened the rear door. Jacob descended carefully, Cain finding the snow. Maria followed. Daniel unfolded himself from the back seat and stood in the cold night air and looked up at the estate and exhaled a long, slow breath that turned white in front of him and dissolved. Martinho reached into the car and retrieved the worn envelope. He held it out to Jacob. Jacob looked at it. "The debt," he started. "Is handled," Martinho said. "Keep it." Jacob stared at the envelope in Martinho's outstretched hand, at the soft creases worn into it from a week of folding and refolding, at everything it represented: the jewelry sold, the account emptied, the full weight of two people's lives distilled into insufficient paper. He took it. He couldn't speak. Martinho looked at Daniel one final time. "I meant what I said," he told him quietly. "I'll be watching." Daniel met his eyes. "I know." Martinho held his gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded once, brief, final, and turned toward the estate's doors. and the snow fell softly around the three of them standing in the driveway, and Jacob put his arm around his grandson's shoulders, and Maria leaned into both of them, and for a long moment, none of them moved. They simply stood together in the cold. Whole. The snow stopped just before sunrise. It ended the way it had begun, without announcement, without ceremony, simply ceasing at some point in the early hours, so that by the time the first pale light began pressing through the tall windows of the estate, the world outside was still and white and completely unmarked, fresh, as though the night had never happened, as though the road and the warehouse and the frozen miles and everything in between had been covered over and smoothed away and returned to silence. Jacob was awake before the light. He had slept a few hours, deep and dreamless in a way he hadn't managed in 8 days in one of the estate's guest rooms, in a bed that was too large and too quiet and too far from everything familiar, and had nonetheless claimed him the moment he lay down. Maria had slept beside him, and he had known by her breathing within minutes that she was under. He had listened to it for a while, the simple, steady proof of her. Then he had slept too. Now he sat in the chair by the window, looking at the white valley below. His cane leaned against the wall, his hands rested in his lap. He was not thinking about the debt, or the rival, or the 8 days just past, or the envelope now folded inside his coat pocket. He was thinking about Daniel asleep somewhere in this house, breathing, alive, here, and he was letting that simple fact wash over him in slow, repeated waves. Enough. It was enough. The door opened softly. Maria came in fully dressed, her gray scarf back around her neck, her white hair combed, carrying 2 cups of tea the way she had carried tea through every difficult morning of their lives together steadily, practically, as though the act of carrying something warm toward another person was itself a form of reassurance. She handed him his cup and sat on the edge of the bed. They watched the valley together in the early light. "Daniel's still asleep," she said. "Good. He needs it." "He does." A silence. Comfortable. The kind built over decades. "We should thank him properly before we leave," Maria said. Jacob nodded. "I don't know how." "Neither do I," she said. "We'll find the words." They found Martinho in the main room, standing at the tall windows with his back to the door, looking out at the snow-covered valley below. He had changed into a dark shirt. His jacket was draped over a chair. He was holding a cup of something coffee, perhaps with both hands, and he was very still, and he was looking at the valley with the expression of a man engaged in a private conversation with himself that had been ongoing for some time. He heard them and turned. "You should have slept longer," he said. "We slept enough," Jacob said. Martinho looked at them both, still carrying the same quality of assessment he had worn since the moment he opened the door. But something in it had shifted over the course of the night. The calculation was still there, but something alongside it now, something that hadn't been there before. Maria crossed the room toward him. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him. This man a full head taller, this man the valley feared, this man with the tattoos climbing his neck and the unreadable eyes and the quiet, total authority, and she placed her hand on his arm. He looked down at it. "You could have been anything," she said softly. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved to the window, to the valley, to the white, unmarked landscape stretching out below the ridge. "I became what I had to," he said, quietly, without self-pity, without defensiveness, just the plain, examined fact of it. Jacob stepped forward and extended his hand. Martinho looked at it, then he took it. Jacob gripped it firmly, the grip of a man who has built things with his hands and means what he expresses through them. "You gave us our family back," Jacob said. "There's no repaying that. I know that. I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise." He held his gaze. "But I want you to know that we see you. Not what people say about you. You." The man who stepped aside and said, "Come inside." He paused. "That man can still choose what comes next." Martinho looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, deep, slow. The movement of something large, shifting position in dark water. "My father would have been your age," he said, so quietly it was almost to himself. Jacob didn't let go of his hand. "Then choose what he would have wanted," he said simply. The room was still. Daniel appeared in the doorway, sleep-rumpled, a borrowed jacket too short at the wrists. He looked at the 3 of them, his grandparents, the man who had walked into a warehouse and brought him out of it, and he stood quietly, not interrupting, understanding without being told that something was happening in this room that was larger than him. Martinho looked at the boy. "Take care of them," he said. Daniel nodded. "I will." I mean it. I know, Daniel said. I know you do. They left as the sun was fully rising. Jacob and Maria in the back seat of one of the estate's cars. Martino had insisted. And Jacob had not argued because Maria's knees were not equal to the walk back to their broken-down vehicle on the mountain road. And he knew it. Daniel sat beside them, his shoulder against Maria's, her hand on his arm. Martino stood at the top of the estate's front steps and watched the car move down the long driveway, through the gate, and onto the road. He stood there until it was gone. Then he went inside. He found his lieutenant waiting in the main room with the day's business already organized, calls to return, arrangements to confirm. The ordinary machinery of his operation waiting patiently for his attention. He looked at the stack of items on the table. "One change," he said. His lieutenant looked up. "Civilian debts," Martino said. "We don't collect them anymore. Anyone who comes to us owing money because they borrowed from someone else, we clear it, and we walk away. No collection. No interest." He held his lieutenant's gaze. The operation doesn't touch people who have no part in this world. Not their families, not their grandparents, nobody. His lieutenant looked at him for a moment. "That's a significant change," he said carefully. "Yes," Martino said. He walked to the window. Below, the valley was bright with new snow. The road was white and empty and clean in the morning light. Somewhere on it, a car was carrying 3 people home. He thought about what Jacob had said. Choose what comes next. He thought about his father, the 11-year-old version of himself who had stood in a kitchen while men from the neighborhood explained how the world actually worked. He thought about Daniel, sitting in a warehouse for 8 days because nobody had shown him another door. He thought about Maria's hand on his arm. You could have been anything. He looked at the valley for a long time. The snow was bright. The sky was clear. The world outside was unmarked and white, and full of the particular possibility that only exists in the hours after a storm, when everything has been covered over, and the next marks on the surface will be the ones you choose to make. He thought about what kind of marks he wanted to leave. He didn't have an answer yet. He suspected it would take longer than a morning to find one. He suspected it would be the work of years, quiet, incremental, without dramatic declaration. But for the first time in a long time, the question felt worth asking. He turned from the window. "Get me the list of open civilian accounts," he said. His lieutenant nodded. "We're closing them," Martino said. "All of them. Today." And outside, the snow lay still and white across the valley. And somewhere on the mountain road, an old car finally started. And it carried 3 people home through the clean morning light. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.
Родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Понятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все равно присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, и тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такое вот. И это борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? На вот это, я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос, а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот, и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там, Мелстрой, задав ему этот вопрос, а кто ты без денег, он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку